They were never meant to be found. That's what the archivist whispered just once, before he folded the crumbling letter shut and shoved it back into the vault, his hands shaking like he'd touched something radioactive. 21 young men, priests in training, gone, erased. Not over a month, not over a war, over 17 years, one by one, from one place. Sacred Heart Seminary. If you've never heard of it, that's not an accident, because what happened there wasn't just covered up. It was surgically removed from American history, excommunicated from the public record, and sealed by the Vatican itself under 150 years of silence. But that silence didn't hold. Tonight, we're going to tear back the veil, and when we're done, you won't be the same. Because this story isn't just about missing priests, it's about how systems use sanctity to mask slavery. It's about how institutions transform faith into control. It's about the psychology of obedience and the people who weaponize it. It's about how evil wears a collar. And it starts in the winter of 1847. Illinois. A seminary, freshly constructed, red brick and Bavarian arches, built by the hands of desperate immigrants who thought they were laying the foundation for God's kingdom in the Midwest. But under that sacred soil, something else had already taken root, something ancient, something corrupt. The church needed American-born priests, not out of holiness, but necessity. The Irish were flooding in, running from famine and British bullets. But Protestant America hated them. Hated their rosaries, their mass, their language. If the church wanted to survive in this hostile land, it had to Americanize its face, and fast. Sacred Heart was the solution. A finishing school for young Catholic men of promise, but behind the lectures and Latin, there were shadows, and 3 men ruled them all. 3 priests imported from Ireland: Reverend Edmund Walsh, Rector Thomas Murphy, Dean Patrick O'Brien, educated, charismatic, untouchable. But there's just one problem. They weren't priests. They were imposters, killers, grifters from the Cork underworld who murdered the real clergy during a transatlantic voyage and assumed their identities. They didn't come to teach faith, they came to harvest souls. And the church never questioned it. Why? Because when the system is rotten, the gatekeepers become ghosts, and the lambs are handed to wolves. The first rule of manipulation is simple: isolate the subject. And Sacred Heart was perfectly built for isolation. 40 miles from the nearest major city. No trains, no telegraphs, just endless whispering prairie grass stretching into oblivion. Once those boys arrived, they were cut off from family, from friends, from the world. No one could hear them scream, and that wasn't metaphor. Letters, monitored. Visitors, rare. Departures, forbidden without permission, and permission was never granted. The seminary's grounds were patrolled, not by guards, but by silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, watchful, like someone or something is always listening. The routine was rigid. Wake before dawn. Pray. Study. Pray. Work the grounds. Pray. Eat in silence. Confess sins. Pray again. Lights out. Day after day. Week after week. But beneath that discipline wasn't devotion. It was control. Conditioning. Because when you're exhausted, starving for affection, and begging for approval from an authority that never fully gives it, your identity fractures. You become programmable. And the priests, they knew it. That's why they didn't just demand obedience, they demanded total erasure of will. You weren't there to learn theology, you were there to be broken, rewritten. They controlled everything: what you read, when you slept, how you thought, even how you dreamed. They introduced punishments that would later appear in CIA manuals: sensory deprivation in the basement chapel, forced fasting, public confession under threat of expulsion, not as penance but as psychological warfare. Strip a young man's dignity, and he'll do anything to feel whole again. That was the real curriculum at Sacred Heart. And while the church hierarchy turned a blind eye, donations from powerful Catholic families poured in. Money meant protection, and protection meant secrecy. The boys who vanished, they didn't leave overnight. They were slowly erased. One by one. It began with silence. A student wouldn't show up for breakfast. No one was allowed to ask. Then his name disappeared from the attendance logs. His letters were returned unopened. Within days he was gone from memory, like he'd never been there. But one boy didn't forget. Joseph Kennedy, Michael Brennan's roommate. And when Michael vanished, Joseph noticed something no one else did. Michael's winter coat still hung by the door, his boots, his rosary. No man would travel in that deadly cold without them, unless he hadn't traveled at all, unless he never left the grounds, unless he was still there, somewhere beneath. And that's when Joseph began to dig. It started with footsteps, late at night, after the prayers, after the final bell, when the halls should have been silent, when every candle was out and every boy was locked in his cell-like dormitory. Joseph Kennedy heard them, slow, deliberate, heavy, not pacing, not patrolling, hauling, dragging. He held his breath and pressed his ear against the cold stone wall, and he realized something he hadn't before. Sacred Heart Seminary had a second voice. Beneath the chapel, behind the furnace rooms, past the basement chapel, there were more walls, hollow ones. Joseph wasn't a coward, but he also wasn't a fool. He said nothing for 3 days. Until the fourth night. That's when the screaming started. It was quick, just 2 seconds, but it wasn't the sound of fear. It was pain. Pure, brutal, bone-snapping pain. And it came from directly beneath the floorboards of the library, where the books on canon law and divine justice lined the walls like sentries. No one else seemed to hear it, or no one else admitted to hearing it. Joseph couldn't sleep after that. He waited until Sunday evening, the only time students were allowed half an hour of an supervised recreation, and slipped away from the group. He went back inside the seminary, moving fast, moving quiet, down the servant stairs, past the kitchen, into the laundry chute, and there, at the bottom, behind the industrial furnace, he found it. A false panel, slightly warped, just enough space for a slim teenager to slip through. Behind it, a passage. Stone steps descending into darkness, carved so roughly they looked like they'd been made in haste, or in desperation. He lit his match. The air hit him first, not rot. Worse. Rust, iron, blood. The room at the bottom was empty, almost, except for the hooks. 6 of them, bolted to the wall, with dried black stains stretching toward a grate in the floor. Chains hung from the ceiling like chandeliers from hell. And there was something else. A ledger. Bound in calfskin, water-damaged, soot-blackened. Inside, names, dates, descriptions. And one phrase repeated in red ink across each entry, removed for relocation. Michael Brennan's name was there. So were 6 others, all officially recorded as transferred, but their corpses were never found. Because Sacred Heart didn't bury its secrets. It bled them out slowly and kept the bones beneath the altar. When Joseph emerged from that hidden stairwell, something in him had changed. It wasn't fear. It was clarity. Because once you see the machine, once you touch the gears grinding beneath the sermons and incense, you can never unsee it. You realize this wasn't just a crime, this was a system, a ritual, and Sacred Heart Seminary was its temple. He didn't tell anyone, not right away. How could he? Who would believe a 19-year-old seminarian accusing 3 esteemed priests of torture, murder, and trafficking? There were no authorities to go to. The county sheriff was Protestant and suspicious of all Catholic institutions. The Bishop of Chicago, he funded Sacred Heart. Joseph was alone, but he wasn't powerless. He began to pretend. He faked obedience, rejoined the routine, prayed harder, smiled wider, and all the while he watched, listened, waited. That's when he noticed it. The pattern. Every disappearance followed the same rhythm, exactly 77 days apart, always after the full moon, always during a period of heavy weather, storms, snow, flooded roads, just enough natural chaos to excuse a delay in communication. The priests didn't fear investigation. They planned it into the calendar. But why 77 days? Why the lunar cycle? Joseph dove into the forbidden section of the library, the shelf marked Heretical Studies, ostensibly for warning, not research. He waited until midnight, picked the lock with a stolen key, and began reading. And that's when the true horror began to unfold. He discovered a forgotten text, De Tribus Sacrificiis, written by an excommunicated Spanish monk in the 1500s. It described a ritual of ecclesiastical inversion, a parody of priestly ordination in which young men were not consecrated to God, but bound to mammon. The ritual required purity, devotion, and sacrifice. 3 per cycle. 7 cycles per season, 21 in total, the same number as the vanished seminarians. It wasn't random. It wasn't even criminal. It was liturgical. Sacred Heart wasn't just a cover for abuse. It was a consecrated engine of corruption, feeding a ritual older than the church itself. And the 3 false priests? They weren't just grifters. They were keepers of something far older than Catholicism, something Roman, something pre-Christian, something that lived in blood and secrecy. The kind of power that doesn't just survive in shadows, it thrives there. Joseph now knew the truth, but truth without power is a death sentence. He had no allies, no weapons, no way to escape. And the walls of Sacred Heart were beginning to close around him. The 3 priests, Walsh, Murphy, O'Brien, they weren't just watching anymore. They were circling. Their sermons grew darker, their eyes colder. Each homily became a subtle inquisition, every theological lecture laced with warnings about betrayal, obedience, and damnation. It wasn't about God anymore. It was about control, submission, the hierarchy. And Joseph felt the noose tightening. Then came the letter, slipped beneath his door during evening prayers, unsigned, unsealed, written in a shaky hand on thin vellum. They found me. I saw the pit. If they learn what you know, you'll be next. Don't go into the chapel during the eclipse. Don't let them take you. There was no name, but Joseph recognized the handwriting. David Anderson. One of the converts. A serious, quiet man, brilliant in moral theology, often underestimated, even by the priests. David had vanished 3 weeks earlier. Official story? He had been called to a special novitiate in St. Louis, but his belongings had remained untouched, his bed made, his books unopened. And now, this note. Joseph realized something else. He wasn't the first. David had also seen the pattern. He'd also searched. And somehow, he'd found the pit. The phrase haunted Joseph. I saw the pit. It wasn't metaphor. It wasn't poetic. It was literal. Beneath Sacred Heart, deeper than the furnace room, lower than the dungeon chapel, there was something else. Something built before the seminary, something buried. But what? He began to trace the seminary's original land deeds, forged, of course, but one detail stood out. Before Sacred Heart was constructed, the land had been home to a crumbling mound structure, a Mississippian temple complex, ancient, pre-Columbian, long abandoned. The church had bought it, leveled it, and built their seminary directly on top, not for convenience, for alignment. The original priests hadn't selected that site randomly, they'd chosen it for its power. And what if that power still echoed at below? Joseph began to piece together the final layer. This wasn't just trafficking, or murder, or even ritual. This was containment. A force buried centuries ago by peoples long erased, sealed beneath soil and stone and sacrifice, was now being fed again. Fed with souls. And the priests, they weren't just serving the church, they were feeding the altar. There's a reason ancient things are buried, not out of reverence, not for preservation, but because some knowledge was never meant to survive. Some truths are too dangerous for daylight. Joseph finally understood this as he stood alone in the seminary's forbidden archive, A room he wasn't meant to find, hidden behind the library wall, opened only with a rusted brass key he'd lifted from Dean O'Brien's cloak while the man dozed in his study, drunk on sacramental wine. It was a vault of nightmares. Charred scrolls, skulls etched with Latin incantations, journals bound in human leather, yes, human, marked with symbols that weren't Greek, weren't Latin, weren't even earthly, not fully. And in the center of it all, a single pedestal. Upon it, a reliquary box, small enough to hold in one hand, locked, cold, humming, not audibly, spiritually. When Joseph touched it, his knees buckled, his mouth filled with the taste of iron, his vision went black, and something spoke, not in words, in knowing. I was sealed, I was fed, I was promised 21. He staggered back, clutched his crucifix, tried to pray, but the words turned to ash in his mouth. This wasn't the devil, this wasn't hell, this was something older, something pre-creation, a hunger, not for sin, but for order twisted backwards, hierarchy inverted, faith inverted, priesthood inverted. It didn't tempt with pleasure, it demanded obedience, absolute, lifeless, final. Joseph collapsed. Hours passed. When he woke, the reliquary was open, empty. And in the dust, till beside it, burned into the ancient stone, was the imprint of a hand. A hand with 7 fingers. He fled, back through the hidden corridors up into the dormitories, and there, waiting in the hallway, was Father Walsh, smiling, calm, eyes like wet stone. Curiosity, Walsh said, is the first sin of angels. And your soul has already been counted. Joseph didn't respond. He couldn't, because Walsh wasn't speaking in his voice anymore. There was another voice layered beneath it, deeper, hollow, vibrating the walls. 77 days remain. The final season begins. Joseph ran, past the chapel, past the refectory, into the woods. But something followed, not footsteps, not pursuit, a presence, like gravity but conscious. And in the wind, a sound like weeping, from underground. Some truths don't just shatter your worldview, they strip your identity like skin. Joseph didn't sleep that night. He couldn't, because what haunted him now wasn't just fear, it was knowledge. Irrefutable, irreversible knowledge. That the world he'd believed in, of faith, of virtue, of divine order, was a lie built on ritual blood and bureaucratic evil. That Sacred Heart wasn't a failure of the Church, it was the fulfillment of its most secret function. And the Church? It wasn't unaware. It was involved. He remembered something from weeks earlier, a visiting bishop from New York, gaunt, glassy-eyed, who had spoken briefly with the 3 priests behind closed doors and left within the hour. Joseph had thought it odd at the time. Now he understood. That bishop hadn't come to inspect. He'd come to deliver the schedule. Joseph began to search through the students' quarters, not for sabotage but for evidence, anything that could prove what was happening in case he didn't survive long enough to tell it. That's when he found it. Behind a loose stone in the wall of Michael Brennan's old room, wrapped in wax cloth, sealed with melted tallow, was a journal, Michael's journal, its star. Ted like any other novice's record of spiritual growth, scripture reflections, prayers, Latin translations. Then it changed, slowly. The tone darkened, the entries became erratic, repetitive. One phrase scrawled dozens of times, "He that feareth is not made perfect in love. He that feareth is not made perfect in love." As if he was trying to convince himself or drown something else out. In the final pages, the writing broke into shaking lines. Sketches of chains, a circle of men in robes, a pit, a name. Praelatus Vitus, the old prelate. Joseph didn't recognize it, but the phrase vibrated with something ancient, something not meant to be uttered. And on the last page, I heard them chanting in Latin, but it wasn't Mass. They were facing away from the altar, toward the earth. I think they were feeding it. I think they already fed me. Joseph shut the journal. And that was when the seminary bell rang. At 3:17 a.m., a time it was never supposed to ring. Unless someone else had just vanished. The bell's echo faded, but the silence it left behind was louder than thunder. 17 a.m. The time of no prayers, no liturgy, no light. Every soul at Sacred Heart was meant to be asleep, but the bell tolling at that hour was a signal, a summons. Joseph moved fast, knowing full well the risk. He slipped from his room, barefoot, heart hammering like a war drum, down the corridor, past the chapel, toward the central stair, and then he stopped. There were voices, low, measured, chanting. Latin, but not liturgical Latin. Older, harsher, almost Etruscan in structure. He pressed himself into the alcove outside the chapel entrance. The door was ajar. Candlelight spilled out across the marble floor like a trail of blood. Inside, he saw them. 9 figures in cassocks, faces concealed by cowls, forming a circle around the altar but turned away from it, as Michael's journ Al had described, facing the floor, not the heavens. And there, at the center of the circle, a boy. Joseph didn't recognize him, too young for priesthood training, maybe 15, limp, barefoot, dressed in ceremonial white, eyes closed, lips parted in sleep or shock. The priests chanted louder. The boy began to convulse, and then he rose, not by his own strength, as if pulled from the spine upward by an invisible cord. And for one horrifying instant, his face twisted, not in agony, but in worship, as though something was pouring through him like a vessel. And Joseph saw it, not with his eyes, but with the core of his being. A second presence in the chapel, low to the ground, spreading beneath the marble, breathing beneath the altar. Not a demon, not a ghost. Something ancient, something that remembers Rome not as history, but as its church. That remembers the crucifixion, not as defeat, but as distraction. That used the church not to suppress the pagan world, but to inherit it. Joseph ran, again. But this time he didn't run for safety. He ran for the dormitories, to wake the others. Because he wasn't the only one left who could see through the veil. And if he was going to expose the truth, he needed witnesses. And survivors. Before the next cycle was complete. Before the blood price of 21 was paid. The wind outside screamed against the walls of Sacred Heart as Joseph reached the dormitories, heart pounding like the hooves of war horses. He didn't knock. He burst into the rooms of the remaining seminarians, whispering only 2 words with the urgency of a man carrying fire. Wake up. Thomas Morrison, Antoine Dubois, Heinrich Müller, Sean Malley. 4 remained. The rest, officially transferred, unofficially, fed. Joseph didn't explain at first. He didn't need to. One look into his eyes and the other boys knew something unspeakable was happening, something that had always existed just beneath the surface of Sacred Heart, but had never quite dared to take shape in their minds. Until now. He locked the doors, lit a single oil lamp, and then he opened Michael's journal. Page by page, word by word. What began as confusion turned to horror. What turned to horror became conviction, and in conviction, the beginnings of resolve. Each boy had noticed something. Strange glances from the priests, whispers through the walls, dreams that weren't dreams. But until that moment, none had spoken of it. Out of fear, out of obedience, out of the training. That's the thing about control systems. They don't need guards. They build the prison inside the mind. But that night, beneath a roof soaked with prayer and soaked deeper in blood, something inside them broke loose. Not rebellion. Recognition. They were not students. They were not chosen. They were selected. For their isolation. For their strength. For their silence. They were product. Joseph laid it out. The priests were not priests. They were facilitators, gatekeepers, of a ritual older than Christianity, draped in Catholic silk, a sacrament of inversion, where the Eucharist wasn't bread turned into body, but body turned into fuel. And the pit beneath the seminary? That wasn't metaphor, that was mouth. And the church didn't just know. The church had licensed it, sealed it, funded it, protected it from us. Because this isn't about theology. It never was. It's about control. And the moment you realize that, truly realize it, you are no longer who you were. You're on the outside now, unplugged, hunted. And if you've made it this far into this story, I need you to prove you're not asleep. Comment the phrase, "I was never meant to wake up," twice. Once for the lie that raised you, and once for the truth that will remake you. Morning came, but no light followed. The sun, obscured by thick, unnatural clouds, cast a sickly pall over Sacred Heart Seminary. It was supposed to be just another day of mass, study, and manual labor, but for Joseph and the 4 others, the illusion was gone. They were no longer students. They were prisoners, marked, counted, watched. The priests knew something had changed. Their movements grew more precise, measured. They began to appear at odd hours, silently, without announcement, as if listening to the walls. Father Walsh's sermons shifted tone too, no longer concerned with God's love or Christ's mercy. Now he spoke only of obedience, of the sin of rebellion, of the dangers of unchecked thought. He quoted obscure scripture, verses rarely used in liturgy, threatening verses. Every branch that does not bear fruit, he takes away and casts into the fire. And when his gaze fell on Joseph, it lingered, not with anger, with certainty. Because Walsh knew. Somehow he knew. That night, Joseph and the boys returned to the crawl space behind the furnace, to the stairwell, to the room with the hooks and the bloodstains. But now, something was different. The ledger was gone. So were the chains. The walls had been scrubbed clean. A new message had been carved above the arch in Latin, Fiat voluntas eius, let his will be done. But it wasn't God they were speaking of. Thomas Morrison, a former Protestant who knew the Bible better than most priests, stared at the phrase for a long time, then whispered, "That's not scripture. That's mimicry." Antoine found something beneath a broken floor tile, a bundle of old photographs, water-damaged but visible, and what they saw confirmed the deepest terror. The photographs weren't from the 1840s, they were from decades later. Different boys, different faces, but the same white robes, the same chapel, the same circle. One photo showed a boy mid-air, levitating, arms outstretched, face contorted with rapture and agony. Behind him, a shadow, not a priest, something taller, blurred, headless. And in the final photo, Father Walsh, unaged, exactly the same. Joseph's hands began to shake. This wasn't a cycle of 17 years. This was a cycle of 77. The ritual didn't restart in 1847. It never ended. And the priests, they weren't imposters. They were hosts. They had to leave. That was the conclusion. Simple. Obvious. Except it wasn't. Because escape was not freedom. Not from this. Not when Sacred Heart knew them. Not when something beneath the seminary had already claimed their names. But still, they had to try. Joseph, Antoine, Thomas, Sean, and Heinrich waited until the seminary bell rang for evening mass. The building for once would be distracted, the priests cloaked in their robes, the halls temporarily unmanned. They moved quickly, grabbing what little they had: rosaries, food, the oil lamp, the journal. No farewells. They slipped out the back gate near the crypt garden, where the statues of saints stood silent vigil. The oldest of them, St. Bartholomew, was missing his face, as if time or something worse had erased his identity altogether. The air outside was colder than it should have been, dense, charged, and above them, the sky churned, black clouds spiraling unnaturally, almost like something vast was breathing just behind the veil. They crossed the perimeter road, past the boundary fence and into the woods, but they didn't make it a mile. That's when the chanting began. Not from behind, not from within the seminary, from around them. The trees pulsed with it, the wind carried it, the shadows between the branches rippled like silk over something massive, moving just beneath. Latin, no, anti-Latin. Backwards, broken, twisted. Non serviam, non serviam, non serviam. Not the cry of Lucifer in defiance, but the whisper of something older, something beneath defiance, something that didn't need to rebel, because it had never obeyed to begin with. The boys dropped to the ground, covered their ears, screamed. And then, a figure stepped from the trees. No, to Walsh, not Murphy, not O'Brien, someone far worse. He wore a cassock, yes, but it wasn't stitched. It was grown, fabric like flesh, eyes like polished bone. His hands weren't hands, they were tithing tools. He didn't speak. He just opened his mouth. And from that abyss came the sound of the seminary bell. Not the small bronze bell above the chapel. The deep one. The iron one. The one none of them had ever heard before. And that was when Joseph understood. They weren't leaving. They were being led back. They ran. They didn't speak, didn't plan, didn't pray. Because in that moment, prayer felt hollow, like whispering to a God who had already abandoned this place. They ran through bramble and frozen soil, through trees that bent like watchers, through wind that howled in Latin. But Sacred Heart is not a building, it is a territory. And the forest? It wasn't outside it. It was part of it. The further they fled, the closer they came to its center. Joseph was the first to realize. The path hadn't curved, but somehow the direction had changed. Landmarks repeated, twice, 3 times, a gnarled birch stump, a cross of stones, a shallow ditch shaped like an eye. They were running in ritual geometry, a maze not made of hedges, but of intent. And then came the whisper. Not a sound, but a pressure in the skull, like a thought not your own, whispered in your own voice. Stop running. You've already returned. Sean collapsed first. He didn't scream, didn't thrash, just fell forward, hands to his ears, eyes rolling back, whispering something over and over. Confiteo, confiteo, confiteo. I confess, I confess, I confess. Blood trickled from his ears, his nose, his soul, perhaps. Antoine tried to lift him, but Thomas shouted, "No, don't touch him. He's already halfway gone." Joseph grabbed Antoine. They kept moving, dragging Heinrich, leaving Sean behind, not out of cowardice, but because they knew. If they turned back now, they wouldn't just die. They would be converted. Not to belief, not to ritual, to use, to function. The pit didn't need believers, it needed vessels. And Sacred Heart had built its machinery well. Every path led back, every whisper nudged closer, every failure to escape fed it. But Joseph had remembered something. From Michael Brennan's journal. A name scrawled in the margins. Not Latin, not English. Algonquin, Oshtek'wa-Neh. Where the bones remember. A place older than Sacred Heart. A burial mound the church had desecrated. The last untainted ground left. If they could reach it, maybe, just maybe, they could break the cycle. He turned north. The others followed, and behind them, the forest began to sing, not with voices, with teeth. The singing didn't follow them. It preceded them. It leaked through the trees like smoke, like fog, like breath. Not music, not even melody, just tones. Low, bone-deep vibrations that made their ribs ache and their teeth itch. And beneath those tones, voices. Not many, just one. Multiplied, not echoing, mirroring. He comes bearing broken light. He comes bearing broken light. He comes. Joseph couldn't tell if the voice was talking about him or through him. But they kept moving. North. Always north. Through the underbrush, past the carved stones and tree roots that felt too symmetrical to be natural. Until the ground changed. The soil thickened, softened, and then it remembered. They had reached it. Oshtek'wa-Neh. The ground rose into a long, low mound, barely visible beneath years of overgrowth and ecclesiastical neglect. But it was there, a holy scar, an ancient burial site older than maps, older than Latin, a place where blood had once been returned to the earth in reverence, not extracted in hunger. Heinrich dropped to his knees. Antoine followed. They weren't religious acts. These were instincts, primitive cellular gestures, like the body recognizing sacred geometry when the mind had long since forgotten it. Thomas traced the stones, circles within circles, spiral glyphs scorched into slate, and in the center, a single standing stone, cracked and moss-covered, but still pulsing with a heat that couldn't be explained by sun or season. Joseph touched it, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel watched. He felt seen, not by the priests, not by the church, but by those who had buried this place to protect us, not to hide evil, but to seal it. This was the lock. Sacred Heart was the key. And the priests, they weren't just feeding the pit. They were trying to open it. Antoine suddenly stiffened. "Someone's here," he whispered. "I feel it. Watching." And they were. Because as they turned back toward the path, 4 shapes emerged through the fog. Not priests, not boys, figures. Cloaked in cassocks, not sewn, but grown from shadows. Their faces were covered in veils of moving ash, and in their hands, no weapons, just mirrors. One by one, they lifted them, toward Joseph, Thomas, Heinrich, Antoine. And in those mirrors, they did not see their own faces. They saw themselves as priests. Draped in red, eyes hollow, mouths chanting, already serving, already home. The mirrors were not glass. They were predictions. Reflections of futures already being built in secret. Joseph staggered backward, unable to look away. In his mirror image, he stood behind the chapel altar, but it wasn't consecrated marble anymore. It was bone, stitched, breathing, and his mouth was moving, chanting. He couldn't hear the words, but he could feel their effect. With every syllable, the pit beneath Sacred Heart opened wider. Not metaphorically, literally. He was calling something out of the earth, and it was answering. He looked away, but the image had already taken root, somewhere deep, like a parasite made of possibility. The other boys screamed. Thomas dropped to his knees, clawing at his own throat. Antoine began to recite scripture backward, unintentionally mimicking the chants they'd heard in the chapel. Heinrich wept, openly, violently, praying not to be saved, but to be forgotten. Joseph knew what the mirrors were doing. They weren't threatening. They were offering. The false priests weren't just murderers. They were recruiters. Every cycle required not just victims, but inheritors. New keepers, new handlers of the ritual. Because eventually the old ones burn out, the flesh fails, the vessel cracks. And when it does, it must be replaced, willingly. The mirrors weren't to terrify them, they were to invite them. And somewhere, beneath the terror, Joseph could feel it. A tug, a pull, not from fear, from power, the knowledge, the control, the secrets, the truth no one else was allowed to know. He could become one of them, not out of evil, out of clarity. That's how it always happens. The system doesn't conquer you, it convinces you that you're the exception, that you will wield the darkness responsibly, that you will use it to protect others, that you are too strong to be corrupted. But Joseph knew better. He took the mirror from the nearest figure, looked deep into it, and whispered, "I see you now, but I do not belong to you." The figure didn't speak, but the mirror cracked from corner to corner, and then so did the sky. The sky didn't break like glass. It tore like skin. A wound opened across the heavens, spilling not light, but sound. A deep, pulsating tone that couldn't be heard with the ears, only felt, like the groan of an ancient beast stirring in its sleep, or the whisper of creation being rewritten. The boys dropped to the ground. Their limbs failed them. Their bones vibrated with a frequency that didn't belong to this world. And from the sky's wound, something looked down. Not a creature, not a god, an awareness. Massive, impersonal, patient. The kind of presence that doesn't hate you. It doesn't even recognize your suffering. It only asks one thing. Will you be of use? Heinrich screamed first. Blood gushed from his nose, his eyes, his ears. His spine arched unnaturally, not broken, reformed. He began to rise, not on feet, on command. His mouth moved independently of his will, repeating a phrase in a voice that did not belong to him. "I am the 12th. I stand in place of the broken 9th. I carry the burden of the next cycle." Joseph rushed to him, but the others held him back, because they saw it too. Heinrich was becoming, and he was not alone. From the shadows beyond the mound, more figures emerged. Students. Former students. Faces once thought vanished, now returned. But twisted, aged without time, hollow-eyed, wearing the vestments of sacred office, but beneath them you could see it. The cost. Skin too tight, nails too long, teeth filed to match the rituals of those who eat without hunger. Michael Brennan stood among them, not dead, not alive, inducted. He looked at Joseph, and for a moment something flickered behind his eyes. Pain, shame, then nothing. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "You shouldn't have remembered. You don't escape Sacred Heart, you inherit it." The false priests stepped forward now. Walsh, Murphy, O'Brien, still ageless, still smiling, and behind them, the earth moved. A ripple in the soil, a breath, not air, but vacuum. The pit beneath the seminary wasn't empty, it was waking, because the cycle was nearly complete. And Joseph? He had been chosen not to die, but to replace. The pit didn't open with force, it opened like an invitation. The mound behind the false priests cracked, not explosively but surgically, a perfect circle, as if the earth itself had been waiting for this moment. Inside, darkness, yes, but not absence, presence. A presence so vast it pressed against the minds of everyone present like a hand pressing against glass. Joseph fell to his knees. The other followed, not in worship, but in sheer neurological collapse. The mind can only carry so much terror before it folds, but something in Joseph held, not strength, will. He stared into the pit, and it stared back. It had no eyes, no shape, no name, but it knew him, in a way no human ever could. It knew his dreams, his doubts, his wounds. It knew the moment he realized the church was hollow, the moment he first lied to a confessor, the moment he touched the reliquary, and something inside him whispered, "You could have all of it, if you just stopped resisting." It knew the temptation, and it was offering again. Because the final part of the ritual was not blood. It was acceptance. They didn't need to kill Joseph. They needed him to choose. Walsh spoke now, his voice layered with others, male and female, child and ancient. "You've seen the truth, Joseph. That obedience is not weakness. That hierarchy is not oppression. That power is not evil. It is simply misunderstood. The world above calls it corruption, but down here, it is order. You could join us, not as a victim, not as a martyr, as a builder. Murphy stepped forward, placing something in Joseph's hand. A collar, black, seamless, heavy. The weight of a covenant. O'Brien whispered into his ear, "There must always be three, one to teach, one to shepherd, one to feed. You are the third, the feeder, the gate." And suddenly, Joseph saw it all, the truth behind Sacred Heart. It was never a school. It was a mouth that required ritual, not for summoning, for containment. The priests weren't trying to unleash it. They were trying to satisfy it, forever. And now that Joseph had seen, touched, heard, survived the cycle, the mouth had turned its gaze to him, because the old feeder was weakening, and the pit had found a new priest. Joseph didn't move. The collar sat in his hand like a living thing, warm, pulsing faintly, not with heat but with will. It didn't demand to be worn, it anticipated it. That was how it worked, not through force, through invitation, through carefully constructed inevitability. You weren't made to feel enslaved. You were made to feel chosen. Like all this suffering meant something, like you'd earned your seat at the altar of power. The other boys stared at him. Antoine, blood running from his nose. Thomas, murmuring Hail Marys through cracked lips. Even Heinrich, still partially locked in whatever force had gripped him, was watching, waiting. They didn't want Joseph to refuse. They wanted to know if he could. The false priest began to chant again, slowly. A new ritual now, not of summoning, of succession. A golden bowl was placed at Joseph's feet. It shimmered, not with light but with something more perverse, recognition, as if the object itself had waited centuries for this moment. Walsh extended a knife. Ceremonial, curved, engraved with a language that bent the eye when stared at too long. "Cut the palm, let the blood fall, seal your name into the lineage," he said. "You do not become a monster. You become the one who feeds them. You become essential." Joseph stared into the pit behind them, and then he understood. This was the final test, not just for him, for the system. Because if he gave in, if he offered himself not as victim but vessel, it would mean the machine worked, that corruption could be inherited like liturgy, that all evil had to do was wait. He lifted the blade. The boys gasped. Even Walsh's expression faltered, just a fraction. Joseph raised his hand, his right palm, turned it outward, held the blade to it, paused, then spoke. "You chose the wrong priest." And in one motion he threw the blade into the pit. The chanting stopped. The pit screamed, not audibly, not even psychically. The entire seminary shook. Stone groaned. The sky tore again, wider. This time not bleeding shadow, but memory. The truth they had buried, the 21, the rituals, the its origin, it all erupted, not in fire, in revelation, and for the first time in 2 centuries, the feeder denied its meal. The ritual was broken, but the cost had only just begun to collect. The pit collapsed inward, not like a cave-in, but like something vast and angry withdrawing its limbs. The ground beneath Sacred Heart didn't just crack, it buckled, like the entire earth had been holding its breath, and now it was choking. The false priests reeled, not in pain, in disbelief. Their mouths opened, jaws dislocating, as if trying to inhale what had been lost. But the ritual was severed, the contract voided. And Joseph? He didn't run. He stood, trembling, bloodless, but unchanged. The collar still lay in his hand, no longer pulsing, now just dead weight, like a failed weapon, or a rejected crown. O'Brien rushed him first, faster than human movement. His robes dissolved mid-stride, revealing a body that hadn't been flesh for years. It wasn't decay, it was overuse. Veins like roots, skin like paper stretched too thin over machinery built to extract meaning from agony. Joseph didn't fight, because the Mound did. The standing stone at the heart of Oshtek'wa-Neh, dormant for generations, lit from within. Not with light, with memory. It wasn't just a burial site. It was a seal, the original one, laid by hands older than the empire that became the church, older than the priests, older than the language that tried to erase them. And now, awakened by Joseph's refusal, it reactivated. O'Brien was lifted mid-air, frozen, writhing, but not dying, being shown. His eyes rolled back as the stone poured ancient memory into his mind, centuries of resistance, tribes standing in defiance, blood spilled not for power, but for protection. And when the vision ended, O'Brien collapsed. A husk. Walsh and Murphy backed away, hissing a language no human tongue had spoken since before the pyramids, but it was too late. Because Antoine stepped forward now, face pale, fingers trembling, eyes locked on the collar in Joseph's hand. "Give it to me," he said. "I can finish it. I can wear it. Not for them, for us. I'll control it. I'll close the cycle for good." And Joseph realized. The pit had lost. But its infection remained. It didn't need to win with priests. It only needed one man, to believe he could wear the darkness safely. And that's how the curse continued. Not in ritual, in rationalization. Joseph stared at Antoine, and in that moment, he saw it clearly. Not Antoine the boy, not the friend who'd whispered prayers in the night, but a flicker, a fracture in the soul. The first crack in a man who thinks he can master the thing that devours kings. "I wouldn't serve it," Antoine whispered, eyes glassy. "I'd control it. I'd starve it. Bury it deeper. Make it fear me." Joseph didn't speak. He didn't have to. Because that's the final seduction. The lie that you are the exception. That you can wear the collar and remain a man. That you can chain the beast and use it for good. But Joseph knew the truth. You don't wear darkness. Darkness wears you. He slowly extended the collar, not to hand it over but to show it, to let Antoine see it clearly, what it truly was. Not leather, not cloth, but skin, stitched together with sinew and vows, and stitched into it, the names, seared in a ring around the inside. 20, each a feeder, a failed redeemer, a man who thought he was strong enough, until he wasn't. And one space remained, blank, waiting. The collar wanted Antoine, and Antoine wanted to be needed. Thomas intervened, voice cracking with fury. "That's what it does, Antoine. It doesn't kill your body. It rewrites your purpose. It makes you think you're the cure. That's how it spreads." But Antoine didn't back down. "What if I am the cure?" he said. "What if we're here to finish what the others couldn't?" And there it was. The real danger. Not the priests, not the rituals, but the seed, the system plan. It's in men. That if you suffer enough, sacrifice enough, learn enough, you deserve to sit at the table where power eats reality, and in that seed, the next cycle is born. Joseph didn't argue. He acted. He threw the collar hard into the heart of the pit. The moment it crossed the threshold, the pit screamed again, this time not in fury, in hunger. It tried to reach for him, to claim him, to trick him one last time. But Joseph spoke a word. A single syllable burned into the standing stone's base, older than Latin. Asheton. The seal responded. Light, no, memory, rushed from the mound like a flood. It wasn't exorcism. It was restoration. And in that wave, Sacred Heart shook. Not as a building, but as a machine finally shutting down. The ground rippled beneath them, like flesh sloughing off bone. The seminary groaned, beams splintering, mortar cracking. The tower bell rang once, then shattered. The machine was failing, and not just in brick and blood, but in purpose. Sacred Heart wasn't crumbling. It was dying. Its purpose, to process devotion into obedience and obedience into offering, was unraveling. Because one boy had refused. That was all it took. Not violence, not exorcism, just a single man saying, "No more." The ancient force beneath, the mouth, the pit, the feeder, could take lives, could twist flesh, could write its gospel into skin. But it couldn't survive rejection, not from within the system. The standing stone pulsed again, and this time it didn't seal. It revealed. A shockwave of memory, not just of the 21 priests, but of the first sealers, the people who'd buried the pit, before the church, before the Romans, before language. Images flooded Joseph's mind, warriors and women in painted ash, standing in circles not to summon but to contain, sacrificing not others but themselves, not to gain favor but to lock evil in place. Their blood had been pure, not because they were holy, but because they refused to use power for themselves, and Sacred Heart had desecrated that, not out of ignorance, but out of ambition. It had unearthed what was meant to stay buried, and repurposed it into ritual. The collar was a symbol, yes, but deeper than that. It was a contract. A man wore it and became a node, a conductor between the world above and the mouth below. Break that link, and the system starves. And that's exactly what Joseph had done. The collar had not been accepted, the ritual not fulfilled, the mouth unfed. But the beast still lived. Now starving, now furious, now free. The ground split again, this time not in a neat circle but in spirals. Wild, aimless, the kind of movement that says, "I have lost control and I will take everything with me." The forest caught fire, not from flame, but from memory combustion. The trees burned with truth. Visions of all those who had vanished, priests, students, laymen, burned into the bark, into the air, into the soil. Sacred Heart was telling its story, because without silence the ritual is weak, and now finally someone was listening. But the price wasn't paid yet, because something else had risen from the pit, not the mouth, the voice. And it had one final name to speak, Joseph's. It didn't speak aloud. It didn't need to. The voice slid beneath Joseph's skin, bypassing his ears, bypassing language. It wrote itself directly into his thoughts, as if his consciousness was merely parchment waiting to be inscribed. And what it said was simple. You broke the cycle, now you must replace it. Because systems, especially ancient ones, don't vanish when defied. They adapt. The moment Joseph denied the collar, denied the offering, denied the feast, he became something else in the eyes of the machine. He was no longer prey. He was custodian. The seal had not destroyed the pit. It had merely re-anchored it. The system couldn't function without a feeder, and now, having severed the ritual, Joseph had unwittingly taken its place, not through blood, through will, through choice. This was the final lie. That resistance leads to freedom. Sometimes it just leads to inheritance. The voice inside him continued, not begging, not commanding, informing. You see now. The others refused to look. You looked. Now you must hold it shut, forever. Joseph dropped to his knees. The others watched in silence. Antoine shaken. Thomas weeping. Heinrich still muttering fragments of prayer through bloodied teeth. The forest was collapsing around them. Sacred Heart Seminary, once a cathedral of authority, was now a dying husk, vomiting its secrets into the sky. And through it all, the presence waited, not in malice, in expectation. Joseph stood, and in his hand, though he hadn't picked it up, was the collar, reformed, whole again. But this time, cold. No longer seeking his submission, no longer seductive, now it was contractual. He could leave it, and the pit would rise, or he could wear it, and the world above would be spared, for another cycle. The trees whispered, the mound pulsed, the others looked to him, not as leader, as offering, and Joseph understood the deepest horror of all. This was never about evil, it was about structure, because even darkness requires administration. And now, he was the administrator. He placed the collar around his neck, not out of defeat, out of duty. And the pit fell silent, for now. The moment the collar closed around his neck, the forest exhaled. A long, low sigh through trees, soil, and stone, as if the earth itself had been holding breath for 1,000 years. And now it could rest, but not in peace, in containment. Joseph didn't collapse. He didn't scream. He simply stood taller. Not because the collar gave him strength, but because it required posture, authority, stillness. He was no longer a boy. He was now the final lock, the seal. Wasn't just underground anymore. It was in him. The false priests began to retreat, not fleeing but fading. Their forms flickered, dissolving into strands of smoke and time. Not destroyed, recalled, like tools returned to the drawer. Because they had served their purpose, they had built the cage. But he would now maintain it. Thomas stepped forward. "What have you done?" he whispered. Joseph turned. His voice was calm, but it didn't echo like before. It resonated, low and weighted, like every word came from beneath the ground. "I've ensured there's a world left for you to ask that question in." Antoine staggered, shaking. "You were supposed to end it, not become part of it." And Joseph looked at him, not with judgment, not even sadness, with understanding. Because that was the final revelation. This was never about ending the system. It couldn't be ended, only managed. The cycle was not the disease. It was the containment protocol. The 21 were never random. They were not sacrifices. They were bindings. Each one a lock, a prayer, a plug in the mouth of a cosmic wound that had no shape, no morality, just momentum. And now, with the ritual severed and the old feeders gone, the structure needed a new spine. And it had found one. In a man who had seen everything, and still stood. The seminary behind them collapsed into itself. Not with fire, with silence. A vacuum where theology had once masked ritual infrastructure. And as the dust cleared, the mound pulsed once more, then dimmed. Dormant again. Joseph turned to the others, voice sharp now. "Leave this place. Never return. Never speak of it. Not because you're cowards, because if you do, the pit might remember you, and I won't be able to hold it alone." They didn't argue. They ran. And as Joseph stood alone in the clearing, he didn't pray. He listened, to the pulse below, to the thing that would sleep again. Because he was the sea. Ola now, the final priest, the last gate. Joseph stood in the ashes of a collapsed theology. No vestments, no incense, no congregation, just duty. A role older than scripture and colder than stone. He could feel the collar now, not as an object, but as a network. It stretched beneath the soil, into roots, bones, archives, minds. A lattice of compulsion and containment. It wasn't power. It was responsibility weaponized, and it didn't stop with Sacred Heart. The collar was a key to a map that wasn't drawn on paper, but memory, etched in echoes across the country. Other places, other sites, dormant now, but hungry, and he could feel them all, like pressure points in the soul of the land, like mouths, waiting for feeders. Sacred Heart had been just one node. The boys had escaped. But Joseph knew what came next. Not for him, but for them. They'd be watched, whispered to, tempted, approached. Not by demons, by men. Men in suits, men in robes. Men who speak in riddles and shake your hand too tightly. Men who smile too long when you say the word truth. Because this system doesn't die with the crumbling of one building. It restructures. It finds new architecture, new curriculum, new candidates. The collar does not want believers, it wants engineers. And now Joseph could see the full scope. The system isn't hidden, it's embedded. In seminaries, in think tanks, in intelligence agencies, in elite universities, in private retreats funded by names that never appear in public, all of them bound together, not by creed, but by a single question. What are you willing to sacrifice to hold the world together? And when they find someone willing to say everything, they hand him a collar. And another feeder is born. Joseph felt it tightening now. Not around his throat, but around his timeline. His future was sealed. No family, no grave, no legacy. Just a name whispered once every 77 years by whatever acolyte survived long enough to forget his face, but remember his function. Because that's what he was now. Not man, not monster, mechanism. And somewhere deep below, the pit purred. Not pleased, satisfied. For now. 77 years later, a novice priest arrived in rural Illinois. He had no name in the public record, no baptismal certificate, no relatives. Just a letter, bearing a Vatican seal long since retired, and a request: place him at Sacred Heart. If no longer active, reopen it. Let the silence serve its purpose. The parish archivist who received him didn't question it. Because the system doesn't need belief, it only needs participation. And so, the land was cleared, the ruins examined, the documents revised. The foundation laid again, exactly where the mound had once breathed. A new chapel was built, this time in modern concrete and glass, this time with security cameras and biometric locks. But beneath it, the same pulse, because the pit had not been sealed, it had been negotiated with. And Joseph? He was still there. Not physically. That body was long gone, buried anonymously beneath layers of false death certificates and church property ledgers. But his role, the gate, the collar, the feeder, was intact, embedded, integrated. He had become the blueprint, the prototype, the acceptable compromise. Because in a world ruled by hidden hierarchies, the worst things are never destroyed. They're licensed. He exists now as a pattern, a rhythm of silence that trains new men to submit with pride, to obey without question, to call ritual abuse sacrifice, to call containment faith, to call control salvation. The modern feeder doesn't wear robes. He wears a badge, or a podium, or a doctorate in behavioral compliance strategy. And you've heard him speak. You've seen his eyes. When a politician talks about necessary evils, when a psychologist discusses optimal trauma thresholds, when a priest excuses hierarchy over morality, you're hearing echoes of Joseph's, his inheritance. A man who refused the pit and became its administrator, because that's how the system wins. Not by hiding in the shadows, by training you to become them. One priest at a time, one cycle at a time. Until the pit doesn't have to open anymore, because we carry it with us, because we build cathedrals over it, because we call it church. There's a reason you've never heard this story in history class. Not because it's myth, but because it's method. You see, forbidden history isn't erased with fire. It's erased with redirection. Not hidden from the public, fed to it in half-truths, wrapped in faith, cloaked in patriotism, whispered through institutions we're told are sacred. That's the brilliance of the machine. It doesn't suppress truth. It inverts it. turns whistleblowers into madmen, turns martyrs into footnotes, turns feeders into saints. And Sacred Heart? That was just the Midwest prototype. There were others. New York, Vienna, Buenos Aires, Manila, even deep beneath Vatican Hill itself. But they don't call them pits anymore. They call them archives, retreat centers, intelligence nodes, behavioral laboratories, all doing the same thing Joseph did, containing something no one dares name. You want to know why every generation feels more disoriented than the last? Why every institution eventually rots from within? Why every man of conscience seems to either disappear or fall in line? Because the pit isn't just beneath us, it's inside the frameworks we trust. And once you know that, the world never looks the same. You start to see it everywhere, in the scripted fall of good men, in the silence that follows every institutional scandal, in the way secrets don't just hide, they're structured. You were never meant to know what happened at Sacred Heart. Because once you see it, once the collar appears, even in story, the system records, atches you. Not with cameras, with calculus. It watches what you do with this knowledge. It waits to see if you joke, if you dismiss, if you shrug and move on, because the ones who do, they're harmless. But the ones who pause, the ones who feel something inside them waking, the ones who ask, what am I standing on? Those are the ones the system fears, because they've heard it. The call, not to obedience, not to rebellion, but to remembrance. And once a man remembers, he can't be unmade. The first time you hear it, it sounds like fiction, a seminary, a pit, a priest who refused. But fiction doesn't cling to the edges of your spine. It doesn't nest in your dreams. It doesn't make you wake up at 3:17 a.m. staring at the ceiling, certain something ancient is beneath you. This does, because Sacred Heart is a story. But it's also a structure. The system it revealed isn't allegory, it's architecture. You've seen it. Every time a man with power asks for your trust and punishes your questions. Every time an institution fails spectacularly and yet somehow grows stronger in the aftermath. Every time truth is dangled just out of reach, labeled as conspiracy, while the real crimes remain archived, declassified only when it no longer matters. That's the pit. It doesn't live in fire and screams. It lives in normal, in uniforms, in rituals, in quiet compliance. It feeds not on bodies, but on belief. And the collar? It doesn't always look like Joseph's. Sometimes it's a pension, a promotion, a plaque on the wall that says, you've served well. But if you listen closely, really closely, every man who's worn one eventually hears the same thing whispered through their thoughts. You are not here to save. You are here to hold the gate. That's the question the system asks of every man. Will you stand at the mouth and lie to the world about what you see? Joseph said no. And in doing so, he didn't destroy the system. He became the one thing it fears, a man who knows why he resists, a man who sees power and does not envy it, a man who feels the hunger of the pit and chooses to starve it. That's what makes him dangerous, not his courage, his clarity. And if you've made it this far, if you've felt the weight of this story settle behind your eyes, and you know it isn't just a story, then part of you remembers too. You've seen the collar. Maybe you're wearing it. Maybe you're reaching for it. But you still have a choice. You can turn back, or you can keep going, and become something the system never intended. Unafraid. There's a moment, every man reaches it, when he realizes he's been lied to since birth. Not by accident, by design. That every oath of loyalty, every chain disguised as tradition, every institution draped in ritual was built not to guide him, but to bind him. That's when the system gets nervous, because a man who's been betrayed is dangerous, but a man who's awake, he's unstoppable. Joseph didn't save the world. That's not how this works. He didn't burn down the seminary. He didn't slay the pit. He didn't become a hero. He became a keeper. But that's not the ending, that's just one path. Because you don't need to wear the collar to resist the system, you just need to stop believing it deserves to exist. Every man watching this, especially you, is standing on sacred ground layered with broken bones and buried truths. And beneath all of it, the system waits. For your compliance, for your submission, for you to look away. But not tonight. Tonight you listened. You saw the shadows in the stained glass, the rot beneath the robes, the hunger behind the hierarchy. And if you feel that rising in your chest, rage, sorrow, a quiet, terrifying clarity, then you've begun the descent into dangerous awareness. And that's where real transformation begins. This channel isn't here to entertain, it's here to unplug, to reach into the algorithm and whisper what your teachers, your pastors, your leaders never dared. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed, and it wasn't built for truth, it was built for control. Now ask yourself, who benefits when the past is forgotten? Who profits when obedience is framed as faith? Who thrives when every man is too busy, too tired, too afraid to dig beneath the altar? And most of all, who feeds the pit when no one else will? Because if you don't ask, you'll answer it with your life. Just like the 21 did, just like Joseph did, just like you might, if you forget what you learned tonight. This is the part they fear most. Not the revelation, not the history, not even the rage. What they fear is you remembering. Because once a man remembers, he's no longer programmable. He stops consuming lies just to keep his place at the table. He stops mistaking silence for safety. He starts to see, and seeing is the first sin of any free man. That's what Sacred Heart was always meant to prevent, not by killing bodies, by killing memory. But tonight, through a dead seminary, a buried pit, a man who refused the collar, you've reclaimed something they've tried for centuries to erase. The architecture of control. And now, it's yours to dismantle, piece by piece, lie by lie. But make no mistake, what you carry now is dangerous. Not because it's forbidden, because it's formational. Because if you let it change you, really change you, you will no longer be a citizen of their world. You will no longer pray the way they trained you. You will no longer obey the way they conditioned you. You will no longer belong to the architecture they built around your mind. You will be an exile. But exiles build kingdoms of their own. So here is your final task. In the comments, post this phrase again. Not for the algorithm, not for us, for yourself. I was never meant to wake up. I was never meant to wake up. Because you weren't. The system was designed to keep you compliant, obedient, useful, but you're still here, which means something in you escaped. And now you know. You know that under every sanctuary lies a seal. You know that every institution is a gate dressed as a garden. You know the most sacred truths are guarded by the most vicious lies, and from this moment on, you don't just carry the story, you carry the warning. Let no man silence it, let no priest revise it, let no pit ever claim you again, because the cycle doesn't end by being told, it ends by being broken, and you just became the crack.